The leather chair in the corner of Whitmore and Associates seemed designed to make its occupant invisible, and Margaret Blackstone had perfected the art of disappearing into its worn burgundy cushions. While the rest of the opulent law office buzzed with the arrival of the Blackstone family, she sat with her hands folded in her lap, wearing a simple navy dress that cost less than most of the handbags carried by the women now filling the mahogany-paneled room. The irony was not lost on her. For 30 years, she had moved through the Blackstone mansion like a ghost, managing charitable foundations that bore other people's names, organizing dinner parties where she was introduced as an afterthought, and watching from the sidelines as Richard's children from his first marriage claimed every spotlight. Now, 3 months after Richard's funeral, she occupied the same invisible space while his relatives gathered like vultures around the promise of inheritance. Victoria Blackstone Hartford swept through the doorway first, her designer heels clicking against the polished marble floor with the confidence of someone who had never doubted her place in the world. At 45, she carried herself like the socialite queen she had always been, her blonde hair perfectly styled and her diamond earrings catching the afternoon lights streaming through the tall windows. Behind her came her younger brother James, his expensive suit fitting like armor as he surveyed the room with calculating eyes that had been trained from birth to assess value and opportunity. I wonder where you're watching this from today, whether you're in a place where family dynamics feel familiar or foreign to your own experience. The Blackstone family gathering might remind you of relatives you know, those who measure love in dollar signs and respect in inheritance checks. Margaret watched as Victoria air-kissed distant cousins and family friends, her voice carrying across the room as she discussed weekend plans at the Hamptons house she assumed would soon be hers. The woman had never worked a day in her life, yet spoke with the authority of someone who believed the universe owed her everything she desired. James positioned himself near the massive oak desk, where Harrison Whitmore would soon reveal the contents of Richard's will, his phone already out as he calculated potential returns on investments he expected to control. The extended family filled the remaining chairs with the practiced ease of people accustomed to formal occasions and substantial inheritances. Richard's sister Eleanor adjusted her pearl necklace while discussing charity galas she planned to chair. His business partner's widow, Patricia, examined her manicured nails while speculating about which properties might become available for purchase. Even the household staff members who had been invited seemed more comfortable in this setting than Margaret, who had helped raise Richard's children and managed his philanthropic interests for 3 decades. Nobody acknowledged her presence, not even a polite nod or sympathetic smile for the widow who had supposedly lost the most. The conversations flowed around her as if she were merely another piece of furniture, expensive enough to belong in the room, but unremarkable enough to ignore completely. Margaret remembered standing in this same position at Richard's funeral, pushed to the side during family photographs, while Victoria and James positioned themselves prominently beside the casket. She had written the eulogy that James delivered, had organized the reception that Victoria took credit for hosting, had managed every detail while being treated like hired help rather than the grieving widow. The pattern had remained consistent throughout her marriage, essential but invisible, necessary but never valued. The whispered conversations grew more animated as family members discussed their expectations. Victoria's voice carried particular well, her tone dripping with false sympathy as she mentioned how poor Margaret would probably receive the guest house, or perhaps a small monthly allowance to help her adjust to life without Richard's support. The words stung not because Margaret needed the money, but because they revealed the complete failure of people she had loved and supported to see her as anything more than a charity case. James' phone conversation was equally revealing as he assured someone on the other end that the business holdings would soon be properly managed by family members who understood market dynamics and strategic planning. His confidence was absolute, his tone suggesting that Richard's death had merely delayed the inevitable transfer of power to more capable hands. The fact that Margaret had been intimately involved in every major business decision for the past 15 years seemed to have escaped his notice entirely. Harrison Whitmore entered the room with the gravitas of a man who had delivered life-changing news to wealthy families for over 4 decades. His silver hair and expensive suit commanded immediate attention, and the thick leather portfolio in his hands promised revelations that would reshape lives and relationships. The conversations died to respectful murmurs as he took his position behind the desk, his pale blue eyes scanning the assembled family with an expression that revealed nothing about the surprises he was about to deliver. Margaret straightened slightly in her forgotten corner, her intelligent brown eyes focusing on the lawyer with an intensity that would have surprised anyone who bothered to notice. But nobody was watching the quiet widow in the simple dress. They were all focused on Harrison Whitmore and the fortune he was about to distribute among people who believed they deserved everything and had earned nothing. The afternoon sun shifted lower in the sky, casting longer shadows across the room as Whitmore arranged his papers with deliberate precision. Margaret's breathing remained steady and controlled, her hands still folded in her lap, but something had changed in her posture. The resignation that had characterized her demeanor for so many years had been replaced by something sharper, more focused. She was no longer simply enduring this gathering. She was waiting for it to begin. The stage was set for revelations that would shatter every assumption in the room. But for now, Margaret Blackstone remained exactly what she had always been in their eyes. The forgotten wife who deserved their pity rather than their respect. Soon, that would change in ways none of them could possibly imagine. Victoria Blackstone Hartford had perfected the art of turning every conversation into a performance, and today's gathering provided her with the perfect stage. She positioned herself in the center of the room where her voice would carry to every corner, her gestures calculated to draw attention to her flawless manicure and expensive jewelry. The family estate, she announced to anyone within hearing distance, would require immediate renovation once it became hers. The old-fashioned decor simply would not suit her vision for entertaining New York's elite social circles. Her plans flowed like water from a broken dam, each idea more extravagant than the last. The East Wing would become a spa retreat for her charity board meetings. The gardens would be redesigned by the same landscape architect who had transformed the Vanderbilt property in Newport. The staff would need complete retraining in modern hospitality standards, assuming any of them possessed the intelligence necessary to adapt to her requirements. Margaret listened from her corner chair as Victoria discussed these renovations with the casual confidence of someone who had never been denied anything she desired. The woman spoke about selling artwork to fund her improvements, disposing of furniture that had been in the family for generations, and converting Richard's beloved library into a yoga studio for her personal trainer. Every word revealed her complete disconnection from the history and meaning embedded in the home where Margaret had lived for 3 decades. James positioned himself strategically near the windows where the afternoon light would highlight his commanding presence when the will reading began. His phone had become an extension of his hand as he fielded calls from business associates eager to discuss the investment opportunities that would soon be available. His voice carried the same entitled confidence as his sister's, but his focus remained fixed on numbers and market projections rather than social standing. The family's shipping division, James explained to his business partner through the phone, would benefit from aggressive expansion into emerging markets once he assumed control. The conservative approach that had characterized the company under Richard's leadership would give way to bold strategies designed to maximize returns. His plans included selling off underperforming assets, restructuring employee compensation packages, and relocating operations to countries with more favorable tax structures. Margaret had heard these conversations before. James had spent years presenting these same ideas to Richard, who had consistently rejected them as short-sighted and harmful to the employees who had built the company's reputation for reliability and integrity. Richard had believed in sustainable growth and ethical business practices, values that seemed antiquated to his son's generation of entrepreneurs who measured success solely in quarterly profit reports. The extended family members added their own layers to the afternoon's display of entitlement and greed. Eleanor Blackstone Morrison discussed her plans to expand her art collection once she received her inheritance, specifically mentioning several pieces she intended to bid on at upcoming auctions. Her knowledge of art history was impressive, but her attitude toward acquiring beautiful objects purely for possession rather than appreciation revealed the shallow nature of her sophistication. Patricia Henley had positioned herself near the door where she could observe arrivals, while maintaining conversations about real estate opportunities. As Richard's former business partner's widow, She possessed insider knowledge about properties the family owned throughout the city and countryside. Her calculations were precise as she discussed which holdings might be available for purchase at family-friendly prices once the inheritance was distributed and various members needed immediate cash flow. The household staff members who had been invited to the reading occupied chairs along the far wall, their presence serving as silent witnesses to the family's casual disregard for the people who had maintained their comfortable lifestyle for decades. Mrs. Chun, who had managed the household for 20 years, sat quietly while Victoria discussed replacing the current staff with younger, more energetic employees who would better understand her expectations. Margaret remembered the night Richard died, how she had held his hand while Victoria and James argued in the hospital corridor about funeral arrangements and burial plots. She recalled the weeks following his death when family members had descended on the house like Lockhewics, claiming personal items and family heirlooms while she grieved in isolation. The pattern of dismissal and disrespect had continued through every interaction, as if her 30 years as Richard's wife and partner had earned her nothing more than polite tolerance. The cruelty was not always overt. Sometimes it manifested in subtle exclusions, like the family dinner where Victoria had announced her engagement without bothering to inform Margaret until the event was already planned. Other times it appeared in casual dismissals, like James referring to Margaret's charitable work as her little hobby projects rather than the substantial philanthropic initiatives that had distributed millions of dollars to worthy causes throughout the city. Harrison Whitmore entered the room with the solemnity befitting his profession and the magnitude of the occasion. His silver hair was perfectly styled, his charcoal suit impeccably tailored, and his leather briefcase suggested the weight of documents that would reshape multiple lives within the hour. The conversations gradually died to respectful murmurs as family members recognized that the moment they had been anticipating for months was finally at hand. Whitmore's pale eyes swept across the assembled family with the practiced assessment of a man who had witnessed both the best and worst of human nature when large sums of money were at stake. His expression revealed nothing about the contents of the will he carried, but his movements possessed a deliberate precision that suggested he understood the gravity of what was about to unfold. Margaret watched the lawyer's entrance with the same quiet intensity she had maintained throughout the afternoon. Her position in the corner chair had provided her with a perfect vantage point to observe every conversation, every gesture, every revelation of character that had played out before her. She had cataloged each dismissive comment, each casual cruelty, each assumption about her place in the family hierarchy. The room fell silent as Whitmore arranged his papers on the massive oak desk, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the Persian rug that had witnessed decades of important family gatherings. The air seemed charged with anticipation and barely contained greed as family members prepared to discover the extent of their good fortune. Margaret's hands remained folded in her lap, her breathing steady and controlled, but something fundamental had shifted in her demeanor. The passive resignation that had characterized her behavior for so many years had been replaced by a quality that was harder to define. She was no longer simply enduring this gathering or waiting for it to end. She was preparing for something that would change everything, and despite her 30 years of invisible presence in this family, she was the only person in the room who truly understood what was coming next. Harrison Whitmore adjusted his reading glasses with the deliberate precision of a conductor preparing to lead an orchestra through a complex symphony. The thick document before him represented months of careful legal preparation, and his 4 decades of experience had taught him that wealthy family will readings could transform relationships in ways that lasted generations. Today would prove to be no exception to that rule. The formal ceremony began with minor bequests that served as a gentle introduction to the more substantial provisions that would follow. Mrs. Chun received a generous pension and continued residence in the carriage house for as long as she desired. The groundskeeper inherited the greenhouse and enough funds to maintain his horticultural studies. Each household staff member discovered that Richard had remembered their years of faithful service with thoughtful gifts that reflected his appreciation for their dedication. Margaret watched these initial announcements with genuine warmth, recognizing Richard's characteristic attention to people who had made his life more comfortable and meaningful. The staff members smiled through tears as they realized their financial security had been assured by an employer who had truly valued their contributions to the family's daily life. Victoria shifted impatiently in her chair as the minor bequests continued, her manicured fingers tapping against her designer handbag in a rhythm that revealed her eagerness to reach the more substantial portions of the inheritance. She had calculated the value of these small gifts and found them unnecessarily generous for people who had simply been doing their jobs. The money could have been better allocated to family members who understood how to invest and multiply wealth rather than waste it on emotional attachments to hired help. The reading progressed to distant relatives and family friends who had maintained meaningful relationships with Richard throughout his life. His college roommate received a collection of rare books they had discussed during annual fishing trips. A cousin who had supported Richard through his first wife's death inherited several valuable paintings that held particular sentimental meaning. Each bequest revealed Richard's thoughtful consideration of individual relationships and shared memories. Whitmore's voice maintained its professional cadence as he announced that Victoria would inherit the extensive art collection that had been assembled over 3 generations of Blackstone family wealth. The paintings included works by masters whose names commanded respect in auction houses and private galleries throughout the world. Additionally, she would receive the penthouse apartment in Manhattan and the summer cottage in the Hamptons, properties that would provide her with the lifestyle she had always expected to maintain. Victoria's response was immediate and unguarded. Her smile broadened as she turned toward other family members, accepting their congratulations with the gracious air of someone whose expectations had been perfectly fulfilled. She caught Margaret's eye briefly and offered a small nod that managed to convey both sympathy and superiority in a single gesture. The poor woman would probably receive something modest but appropriate to her station in the family hierarchy. James learned that he would inherit controlling interest in 2 subsidiary companies that specialized in maritime shipping and international logistics. These businesses had been carefully built over decades and represented millions of dollars in annual revenue streams. His inheritance also included the corporate headquarters building in Lower Manhattan and a substantial portfolio of commercial real estate investments that generated steady rental income. His phone emerged immediately as he began texting business associates about the expansion opportunities that would soon be available. The conservative management philosophy that had guided these companies under Richard's leadership would be replaced by more aggressive strategies designed to maximize market share and profit margins. James had spent years preparing for this moment, and his plans were already in motion. Margaret observed these announcements with the same quiet composure she had maintained throughout the afternoon. Her expression revealed neither surprise nor disappointment as she watched Richard's children receive inheritances that matched their lifelong expectations. She seemed almost detached from the proceedings, as if the outcome held no personal significance for her own future security or comfort. The extended family members received their anticipated bequests with varying degrees of satisfaction and gratitude. Eleanor inherited a substantial monetary gift that would fund her art acquisition plans for years to come. Patricia received several investment properties that would provide steady income and potential appreciation over time. Each announcement confirmed the family's assumptions about Richard's intentions and their own positions within his affections. Whitmore paused in his reading, removing his glasses to clean them with deliberate care while the family members processed the information they had received. The silence stretched longer than necessary, creating an atmosphere of anticipation that seemed disproportionate to the minor administrative details that should have remained. His pale eyes swept across the assembled family before settling on Margaret's corner chair with an intensity that had been absent from his earlier announcements. The lawyer's tone shifted subtly as he explained that Richard's will contained additional provisions that required careful explanation before the final and most significant bequest could be properly understood. The language he had used throughout the reading became more formal, more precise, as if he were navigating legal territory that demanded extraordinary attention to detail and accuracy. A leather envelope appeared from within Whitmore's briefcase, its wax seal bearing the distinctive Blackstone family crest that had marked important documents for over a century. The envelope had clearly been prepared separately from the main will, suggesting that its contents held special significance that Richard had wanted to emphasize through formal presentation and ceremonial importance. Margaret's posture shifted almost imperceptibly as Whitmore held the sealed envelope, her spine straightening and her hands adjusting their position in her lap. The change was subtle enough that nobody else in the room noticed, but something fundamental had altered in her demeanor. She was no longer simply observing the proceedings with detached interest. She was preparing for something that would transform everything everyone in the room believed they understood about power, wealth, and family dynamics. The afternoon sun had moved lower in the sky, casting different shadows across the Persian rug and highlighting details in the room that had been invisible earlier in the day. The atmosphere had grown heavier with anticipation, as if the very air recognized that the most important revelations were still to come. Whitmore's experienced hands held the envelope with the reverence due to a document that would reshape lives and relationships in ways that none of the assembled family members could possibly anticipate or prepare themselves to accept. Harrison Whitmore broke the wax seal with ceremonial precision, his experienced fingers revealing the cream-colored stationery that bore Richard's distinctive handwriting. The lawyer's expression grew increasingly solemn as he read the contents silently first, his pale eyes moving across lines that would shatter every assumption held by the people seated before him. The weight of what he was about to reveal seemed to settle on his shoulders like a heavy cloak. The room had fallen into complete silence, broken only by the soft ticking of the antique grandfather clock that had marked time in the Blackstone family for over a century. Victoria leaned forward slightly in her chair, her curiosity piqued by the lawyer's obvious gravity. James had finally put away his phone, recognizing that this moment required his full attention. Even the extended family members sensed that something extraordinary was about to unfold. Whitmore cleared his throat and began reading in Richard's own words, his voice carrying the weight of a man speaking from beyond the grave to correct profound misunderstandings about the woman who had shared his life for 30 years. The letter opened with an acknowledgement that the family had gathered expecting a traditional distribution of wealth among blood relatives and longtime associates. However, Richard continued, there were truths about Margaret that he had promised to keep confidential during his lifetime, but felt compelled to reveal after his death to ensure justice and proper recognition for the woman who had been far more than simply his second wife. The family was about to discover that their assumptions about Margaret's background, wealth, and contributions to the Blackstone legacy were not merely incorrect, but devastatingly opposite to reality. Margaret was not the poor widow they had pitied and dismissed. She was, in fact, the anonymous benefactor whose generous donations had funded the most significant charitable initiatives bearing the Blackstone family name for over 2 decades. The hospitals, schools, and community centers that had elevated the family's reputation for philanthropy existed because of Margaret's quiet generosity rather than traditional family wealth. Victoria's face began to drain of color as Richard's letter explained that Margaret had been married before to Thomas Chun, a brilliant software engineer whose early innovations in data security had made him extraordinarily wealthy before his tragic death in a car accident when Margaret was only 28 years old. She had inherited his entire fortune, including stock options in technology companies that had grown exponentially in value over the intervening decades. The gasps that filled the room were audible as Whitmore continued reading Richard's revelation that Margaret's inheritance from her first husband now exceeded the total value of all Blackstone family holdings combined. She had chosen to live modestly and anonymously, using her wealth to support causes she believed in rather than pursuing the lavish lifestyle that her resources could easily have provided. James dropped his phone as the letter revealed that Margaret owned silent partnerships in several companies he had assumed were purely Blackstone family enterprises. Her investments had provided the capital that funded expansion projects and weathered economic downturns that would have destroyed businesses operating on traditional family resources alone. His plans to restructure and modernize these companies suddenly seemed foolishly presumptuous. Richard's words grew more pointed as he described watching his family treat Margaret with casual dismissal and barely concealed contempt while she quietly supported their comfortable lifestyle through her anonymous generosity. The family's financial security during the 2008 recession had been maintained entirely through Margaret's intervention, though she had insisted that Richard take credit to preserve family pride and unity. The letter detailed specific instances where Margaret's wisdom and resources had prevented business disasters and family embarrassments. Her financial acumen had guided investment decisions that family members had attributed to Richard's business genius. Her charitable connections had opened doors that the Blackstone name alone could never have accessed. Her quiet diplomacy had resolved conflicts that could have destroyed valuable relationships and partnerships. Eleanor's pearl necklace seemed to tighten around her throat as she processed the implications of Richard's revelations. The art collection she had always coveted had been purchased largely with funds Margaret had provided. The charitable galas where Eleanor had basked in social recognition had been made possible by Margaret's anonymous sponsorship. The comfortable lifestyle Eleanor had assumed was her birthright had been subsidized by the woman she had consistently ignored and undervalued. Patricia's calculations about real estate opportunities suddenly seemed less relevant as she realized that the properties she had hoped to purchase at family-friendly prices might not be available for sale at all. If Margaret possessed the wealth and legal authority that Richard's letter suggested, the entire landscape of post-inheritance opportunities would be dramatically different from what anyone had anticipated. Margaret finally spoke, her voice carrying a calm authority that seemed to emerge from nowhere and everywhere at once. She confirmed every word of Richard's letter with the quiet confidence of someone who had spent years observing others underestimate her intelligence, capabilities, and resources. Her 30 years of apparent submission had been a choice rather than a circumstance, a deliberate test of family character that had produced deeply disappointing results. The woman who had sat silently in the corner chair throughout the afternoon now commanded the complete attention of everyone in the room. Her simple navy dress and modest jewelry no longer seemed like evidence of financial limitation, but rather indications of someone secure enough in their true worth to avoid ostentatious displays of wealth and power. Victoria attempted to speak, but no words emerged as she struggled to reconcile this revelation with 3 decades of assumptions about family hierarchy and social standing. The stepmother she had pitted and dismissed possessed resources that made Victoria's anticipated inheritance seem modest by comparison. The woman she had planned to evict from the family estate had the financial capacity to purchase properties that would dwarf the Blackstone holdings. James stared at Margaret with a mixture of shock and growing dread as he realized that his business expansion plans might require permission from someone he had consistently treated as irrelevant to serious family discussions. The companies he had assumed would soon be under his complete control might actually belong to the woman whose opinions he had never bothered to solicit or respect. Richard's letter concluded with his explanation that Margaret's true nature and contributions would finally be acknowledged through the terms of his will, which reflected not only his love for his wife, but his respect for her character and wisdom. The final provisions would ensure that power and authority rested with the person who had demonstrated the greatest capacity for responsible stewardship of family resources and values. Harrison Whitmore returned to the main will document with the gravity of a judge delivering a verdict that would reshape multiple lives forever. The revelations contained in Richard's letter had been merely the foundation for the complete restructuring of power and authority that was about to unfold. His voice carried the weight of legal finality as he announced that Margaret Elizabeth Blackstone would inherit the primary family estate, including all buildings, grounds, and associated properties that had housed the family for over a century. The words fell into the stunned silence like stones dropped into still water, creating ripples of shock that spread across every face in the room except Margaret's. She sat with perfect composure, her hands still folded in her lap, but her spine had straightened with the unmistakable bearing of someone who had just been confirmed in a position of absolute authority. Victoria's carefully constructed composure crumbled as Whitmore continued reading. The art collection she had inherited came with strict legal restrictions that prevented sale, donation, or removal from the family estate without Margaret's written permission. The paintings and sculptures that Victoria had planned to display in her renovated mansion would remain exactly where Richard had originally placed them, serving as permanent reminders of a legacy she had never truly understood or appreciated. The Manhattan penthouse and Hamptons cottage that Victoria had assumed were hers outright carried similar restrictions. She would have 30 days to remove her personal belongings and surrender the keys to Margaret, who would decide their future use based on family need rather than individual entitlement. The woman who had spent the afternoon planning elaborate renovations would soon be searching for alternative accommodations that she could afford on her newly limited resources. James discovered that his inheritance of the shipping and logistics companies came with a devastating catch that rendered his business expansion plans completely impossible. The subsidiary companies existed as separate entities only on paper, but their actual operations, assets, and credit lines were entirely dependent on capital provided by Margaret's anonymous investments. Without her continued support, the businesses he thought he would control possessed no independent value whatsoever. Richard's letter had explained his reasoning with brutal clarity. He had observed his children's treatment of Margaret for years, documenting their casual cruelty and entitled dismissal of someone who had consistently demonstrated superior character, wisdom, and generosity. Their assumption that wealth and authority should be inherited based on bloodline rather than earned through merit had proven them unworthy of the trust and responsibility that managing family resources required. Margaret stood slowly from her corner chair, the simple act commanding absolute attention from every person in the room. When she spoke, her voice carried the quiet authority of someone who had spent decades observing, learning, and preparing for this moment. She addressed each family member by name, her tone neither cruel nor vindictive, but absolutely uncompromising in its clarity about their changed circumstances. Victoria learned that her plans to sell family heirlooms to fund her lifestyle would be impossible because she no longer possessed legal ownership of anything she had assumed would be hers. The charity board positions she had used to maintain her social standing would likely be withdrawn once other board members learned about her reduced financial circumstances and lack of continued family influence. James faced the reality that his business associates had been interested in partnerships with him only because of his expected inheritance and family connections. The aggressive expansion strategies he had developed would never be implemented because he lacked both the capital and authority to make such decisions. His reputation in the financial community would suffer permanent damage once news of his actual circumstances became known. Margaret revealed that she had been quietly documenting family behavior for years, maintaining detailed records of conversations, actions, and decisions that revealed the true character of people who had consistently underestimated her intelligence and awareness. Audio recordings existed of Victoria discussing plans to sell family property for personal gain. Written communications proved James's intention to fire longtime employees and relocate operations to countries with cheaper labor costs. The extended family members realized that their inheritances carried similar restrictions that made Margaret the ultimate authority over family resources and decisions. Eleanor's monetary gift required annual character reviews that could result in immediate termination for behavior deemed harmful to family values or reputation. Patricia's real estate inheritance included property management responsibilities that answered directly to Margaret's oversight and approval. Whitmore confirmed that Margaret now possessed complete legal authority over all major family holdings, charitable foundations, and business operations. Richard had structured the will to ensure that power rested with the person who had demonstrated the greatest wisdom, integrity, and selfless commitment to family welfare over personal advancement. Every significant decision would require Margaret's approval, and her word would be final in all matters affecting family interests. Margaret announced her intention to restructure the family's approach to wealth and responsibility according to principles of merit, contribution, and character rather than entitlement and assumption. The comfortable lifestyle that family members had taken for granted would continue only for those who demonstrated genuine respect, meaningful contribution, and authentic personal growth. She outlined specific expectations for anyone who wished to remain in her life and continue benefiting from family resources. Victoria would need to find gainful employment and demonstrate consistent charitable work before any discussion of property access could be considered. James would be required to complete business ethics training and prove his commitment to employee welfare before assuming any management responsibilities. The household staff members who had been treated with respect and appreciation throughout Richard's lifetime would continue to receive increased compensation and benefits under Margaret's management. Their loyalty and dedication had earned them permanent security and dignity that contrasted sharply with the uncertainty now facing family members who had assumed their status was guaranteed. Margaret's final words emphasized that love, respect, and family inclusion could not be inherited or demanded, but must be earned through consistent actions that demonstrated genuine character and caring. The people in the room had revealed their true nature through their treatment of someone they perceived as powerless, and those revelations would guide all future relationships and decisions. The transformation was complete. Margaret had evolved from the invisible widow in the corner chair to the undisputed matriarch with absolute authority over everything the family had assumed they would inherit. The people who had dismissed her as irrelevant now faced futures that depended entirely on her mercy, wisdom, and assessment of their worthiness. Justice had been served with the precise accuracy that only truth and time could deliver. Margaret walked to the center of the room with the measured steps of someone who had finally claimed her rightful place in a hierarchy that had excluded her for too long. The afternoon sun cast her shadow across the Persian rug where family members sat in stunned silence, processing the complete reversal of their expectations and the uncertain future that stretched before them under her absolute authority. Her voice remained calm and controlled as she outlined the specific terms that would govern any continued relationship with family members who chose to remain in her life. These were not punishments imposed out of vindictiveness, she explained, but natural consequences for behavior that had revealed fundamental character flaws requiring correction through genuine effort and demonstrated change over time. Victoria attempted to interrupt with stammered apologies and desperate appeals for reconsideration, her carefully maintained composure finally cracking under the weight of her dramatically altered circumstances. The confident socialite who had planned elaborate renovations and charity galas now faced the prospect of finding employment for the first time in her adult life, while learning to live within financial means she had never been forced to consider. Margaret listened to Victoria's pleas with the patience of someone who had endured decades of dismissive treatment without losing her essential dignity or capacity for fairness. However, she explained, apologies motivated by financial desperation carried no weight compared to the consistent pattern of behavior that had characterized their relationship since Richard's death and throughout her marriage to his father. Victoria would have 6 months to find meaningful employment that contributed value to society rather than simply maintaining her social status. She would be required to complete 100 hours of community service working directly with people less fortunate than herself. Most importantly, she would need to demonstrate through actions rather than words that she understood the difference between earned respect and inherited privilege. James attempted a different approach, appealing to business logic and family legacy rather than emotional manipulation. He argued that his management expertise was essential for maintaining the success of companies that employed hundreds of people and generated millions in annual revenue. His restructuring plans, he insisted, were designed to ensure long-term competitiveness in changing market conditions rather than personal enrichment at employee expense. Margaret's response revealed the depth of knowledge she had accumulated about family business operations while being systematically excluded from formal decision-making processes. She had reviewed his restructuring proposals with financial analysts whose expertise exceeded his own, and their assessment confirmed that his plans prioritized short-term profits over sustainable growth and employee welfare. The businesses would continue operating under management teams that Margaret had been quietly evaluating and supporting for years. These professionals possessed both the technical competence and ethical foundation necessary to guide companies through challenging economic conditions without sacrificing the values that had built their reputations for integrity and reliability. James would be welcome to apply for entry-level positions within these companies, but his advancement would depend on demonstrated competence, ethical behavior, and genuine commitment to employee welfare rather than his family name or previous assumptions about inherited authority. The humiliation was complete but not vindictive, offering opportunity for redemption through merit rather than entitlement. The extended family members accepted their reduced circumstances with varying degrees of grace and resignation. Eleanor's art collecting activities would continue on a much smaller scale, funded by income from carefully managed investments rather than large annual gifts. Her charity board positions would depend on her ability to contribute expertise and effort rather than simply writing checks to maintain social influence. Patricia discovered that her real estate holdings would generate steady income, but required active management and genuine understanding of property maintenance, tenant relations, and market conditions. The passive wealth she had expected to receive would become earned income that reflected her actual contribution to successful property management. Margaret announced her expanded plans for the family's charitable foundation, which would now receive substantially increased funding directed toward programs that addressed systemic inequality and educational opportunity. The foundation's work would honor Richard's memory while reflecting values of justice and compassion that their marriage had represented despite family opposition. The foundation would also fund scholarship programs specifically designed to support young people from backgrounds similar to Margaret's own modest origins, ensuring that intelligence and character would be rewarded regardless of family wealth or social connections. These initiatives would create lasting positive impact that extended far beyond the comfort of any individual family member. 6 months later, the transformation Margaret had initiated continued to unfold with the steady persistence of fundamental change that reaches deep roots rather than surface appearance. Victoria had found work at a nonprofit organization serving homeless families, discovering satisfaction in meaningful contribution that her previous lifestyle had never provided. Her community service requirement had evolved into genuine commitment to social justice that surprised everyone, including herself. James had accepted a junior analyst position at one of the family companies, learning business fundamentals from the ground up while working alongside employees whose welfare he had previously considered expendable. His initial resentment had gradually transformed into grudging respect for colleagues whose expertise and dedication exceeded his own despite their lack of prestigious educational credentials. Margaret's leadership of the Family Foundation had earned recognition throughout the philanthropic community for innovative programs that addressed root causes of poverty and inequality rather than simply providing temporary relief. Her quiet competence and authentic commitment to justice attracted partnerships with other foundations and government agencies seeking effective approaches to persistent social problems. The family estate had been transformed into a working example of sustainable living and environmental responsibility, hosting educational programs for students and community groups while maintaining its historical significance and beauty. The changes honored both tradition and progress, reflecting values that transcended individual comfort to embrace broader social responsibility. Margaret stood in Richard's former study, now converted into a planning center for the Foundation's expanding operations, reviewing reports that demonstrated the positive impact of programs she had envisioned and implemented. The room that had once symbolized male authority and exclusion now served as headquarters for initiatives that created opportunity and hope for people who had been systematically marginalized. The woman who had been dismissed as the quiet second wife had become a force for justice and positive change that extended far beyond her family's narrow interests. Her transformation from victim to victor was complete, but more importantly, her example demonstrated that true power lay in character, wisdom, and commitment to values that elevated others rather than simply advancing personal advantage. Margaret Elizabeth Blackstone had claimed her inheritance not just of wealth and property, but of the opportunity to create lasting positive change that would honor the best possible interpretation of family legacy while ensuring that future generations would inherit a more just and compassionate world than the one that had tried to silence her voice for so many years.